I acknowledge that Western is located on the traditional lands of the Anishinaabeg, the Haudenosaunee, the Lenape-Wek, and Arawandran peoples, on lands connected with the London Township and Sombra Treaties of 1796 and the Dish with One Spoon Covenant wampum. With this acknowledgement, I respect the long-standing relationships that Indigenous nations have had to this land as their original caretakers. We acknowledge historical and ongoing injustices that Indigenous peoples, First Nations, Métis, and Inuit endure in Canada, from pipeline appropriation to environmental and cultural racism and community loss. These losses continue to take place even as Indigenous people remake the world in every domain. As treaty people, hopefully settlers in this region, including myself, offer ourselves as partners and accomplices. We accept responsibility as a member of our public institution to contribute toward revealing and correcting miseducation, as well as renewing respectful relationships with Indigenous communities through our teaching, research, and community service. The Clissold Lecture commemorates the life and work of Edward Clissold, who lived from 1833 to 1915. He was one of London's most important early editors and journalists, and retired as editor of the London Advertiser after 33 years on staff. A bequest in 1984 from the estate of Clissold's grandson, Robert Blount, and his wife, Rose Blount, enabled what was then the Graduate School of Journalism to found this annual lecture series to commemorate Edward Clissold's legacy. The Clissold Lecture is one of the highlights of the year at Western, especially for the MMJC, or Masters in Media for Journalism and Communication program. It's an important opportunity for Canada's leading journalists to give Western, the London community, and our online audience a deeper understanding of the critical importance and the complex and changing practice of journalism in many forms and on many fronts. We're in a dramatic moment of experimentation and uncertainty for news organizations, which also means a moment of possibilities, though they aren't simple. We're not in a post-truth society, though there are such claims. Our commitment to complex truth and to the intersecting truths of many groups, not always obvious to each other, is essential. For the practice of journalistic listening, the practice of journalistic listening, writing, and knowing may save us, or will certainly play a role. Though it's not my privilege to introduce our speaker this evening, that goes to MMJC graduate student Yara Juzi, I do want to acknowledge how much I appreciate Kyle Edwards joining us this evening. His writing and work for such outlets as Native News Online and ProPublica are important and generative parts of journalism's change. Following Kyle Edwards' talk, there will be an opportunity for questions and answers, and for that we'd ask you to use the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. Please don't use the chat function, which will be turned off for the occasion. MMJC Graduate Program Chair Jeremy Copeland will relay questions to Kyle Edwards. Thank you for coming, everyone. Jeremy?
Thank you, Lisa, for that. Dean Henderson. I will keep this very short. I would just like to thank the people who helped make this event possible, or some of them anyways. First, our broadcast and IT team, Matt Ward, Paul Buckley-Golder, Ryan Travers, and Charlotte McClellan. And then the team that helped to plan and promote the event, Nikki Mitchell, Becky Blue, Alice Yin, Suzanne El-Sharafa, Amelia Ekbal, Kritanjali Batik, and Tina Donati. Thank you very much for all the work you put into making, bringing this lecture from Kyle Edwards to us and to everybody else. And also thank you very much to everybody who's joined us tonight. And we look forward to your questions at the end of Kyle's talk. I'm now going to hand over, as Lisa mentioned, to one of our students who's currently in the Masters of Media in Journalism and Communication program here at Western. Yara Juzi has stayed up until the middle of the night in Dubai. Thank you, Yara, to hear Kyle Edwards' talk and also to introduce him. So Yara, over to you.
Thanks, Jeremy. Hi, everyone. My name is Yara Juzi, and I'm currently a graduate student in the MMJC program. I'm an international student from Palestine, currently in Dubai, and exactly 1 year ago today, I was actually in Dubai listening to this very lecture as a prospective student. Since then, things have come full circle, and I'm so excited to be here today to introduce this year's Clissold Lecture guest speaker. Today's special guest is an award-winning Indigenous journalist and writer from the Lake Manitoba First Nation. He's worked for the Native News Online, ProPublica and Maclean's, and his reporting has been recognized by the National Magazine Awards and the Canadian Association of Journalists. In 2019, the Canadian Association of Journalists awarded him for being the top emerging Indigenous journalist. In 2020, he won silver at the National Magazine Awards for a feature about the Nishnawbe First Nation, an Indigenous community in Northern Ontario that has been without safe drinking water for over 25 years. His previous work, he investigated the sexual abuse of Indigenous women at worker camps in Canada's pipeline industry and the disproportionate number of First Nations children in Manitoba's foster care system. This special guest is one of the most promising and influential new voices in Canadian media. He is someone that challenges journalists to change how they report on Indigenous issues and communities in Canada by providing a fair, balanced, and accurate coverage of social, political, and economic issues. Our guest is currently a Wallace Stegnar Fellow at Stanford University in California. Please help me join me in welcoming our guest, Kyle Edwards.
Perfect. Well, hello everyone, and miigwech, thank you for being here. And it's an honor to be here, and thank you to Western University for having me, and as well as the Clissold family for putting on such a great event. My name is Kyle Edwards. I'm a journalist and writer from the Lake Manitoba First Nation in Manitoba. And I started my career, I'm joining you first of all from Palo Alto, California, where I've been currently living for the past year and a half. But I started my career in Canada as a reporter for news outlets like the Toronto Star and Maclean's. And over the past 2 years, I've been working and living in the United States, where I've been a reporter and a managing editor at Native News Online. I was also a 2021 Neiman Visiting Fellow at Harvard University, and I greatly appreciated their support last year. I'm currently on a sabbatical of sorts from being a full-time member of the press, and am now a Wallace Stegnar Fellow at Stanford University, where I'm currently working on my first book. So I thought I would just start off this lecture with a bit about myself and my career, and just talk a little bit about some of the stories that I've reported on and how I've reported them. And so the first story I'll talk about is something that was very important to me and very important to my career. And I'll also discuss a little bit about some of the challenges I faced while covering this story. So I'm 28, and it's been almost 5 years now since I was an undergrad at X University in Toronto. As I mentioned, I got my start as a full-time reporter at Maclean's, and I'm immensely grateful for that experience. During my time there, I was able to report on a vast range of topics, but all of the big projects or features that I covered while I was there mostly centered on Indigenous issues. For me as a young reporter, I felt a real responsibility being an Anishinaabe to report these stories. And many of the big and small articles that I wrote were also assigned to me by my editors as well. At the time, from 2017 to 2019, the 2 years I worked for Maclean's, I was the only full-time Indigenous journalist at a Canadian news magazine. I'm happy to be challenged on that fact, but I'm fairly confident in saying that. So the article I'm going to be talking about is an article called "Fighting Foster Care." It was published in 2018. And just before I dive into it a little bit, I'm just gonna play for you all a brief snippet of a video essay that I produced during that time.
Between 1989 and
So just one moment.
Documents show that federal programs are so underfunded that Indigenous parents actually have to give their children away to provincial foster care in order to get help. There's something fundamentally wrong.
And the federal government has been aware of this issue for quite some time. The Auditor General reported in 2008 that the funding for First Nations communities was inequitable. The government sets the budget for child welfare services. INAC oversees Indigenous affairs, and individual agencies are tasked by INAC to deliver the services across the country. The government has used the same formula since 1988 to fund services for reserves. It operates on budget reallocations. So, when new services are needed, like child welfare programs, instead of increasing the budget, money is pulled from crucial services like housing and infrastructure. But all of these are inherently linked to the quality of a child's life. Failing to fund all of them sufficiently only creates a toxic cycle where poverty and poor housing become key drivers for children placed in foster care. But there's a catch. These agencies that are meant to provide child services to Indigenous children are barely able to operate because the funding is so low, let alone provide prevention services. Meanwhile, if children are placed in foster care, costs to keep them there are reimbursed by INAC. Basically, INAC is giving these agencies an incentive to choose foster care as the solution, when the problem is really a lack of funding. This has been confirmed by the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal. In 2007, the First Nations Child and Family Caring Society of Canada and the AFN filed a human rights complaint against the government, which the federal government spent $707,000.
Perfect. Okay, I'm just gonna stop it right there, and I will point out this was an error in the video. Ottawa actually spent way more than this number, $707,000. It spent, I can't remember the precise number, but it was millions. This 707 number was actually just during like a certain brief period of time, like a span of a few months. So we actually had to go and correct that in the written article that I ended up writing. So my reporting on the child welfare system, it really started with this video essay for Maclean's. You know, at the time I had just started full-time at Maclean's magazine. Minister Jane Philpott at the time called the overrepresentation of Indigenous children in care a humanitarian crisis. Because in 2016, Indigenous kids made up over 50% of foster children in Canada, of all foster children in Canada. And then, you know, after I wrote this story, so I pitched it as a video because I thought, okay, this seems like a really interesting way to articulate some of the things that I had been hearing about from people like Cindy Blackstock, who articulated really in detail the sort of policy issues. You know, she pointed to all these reports that the Auditor General reports that pointed to the budget reallocations and how because so many First Nations child CFS agencies were underfunded, the government was sort of giving them an incentive to take more kids into care because it boosted their funding, so to speak. And at the time when I was going through various articles about Canada's foster care system and how it had been treating Indigenous children, I hadn't really read a whole lot of that in the press, particularly the mainstream press, like you know, the big newspapers and all that. I felt like I wasn't seeing that articulated anywhere in the media. So I thought a video would be a great way to do that. But it, you know, once we did this video, my editors came up to me and they said, "Hey, do you want to write a large feature article on this?" And I said, "Absolutely." It was like kind of like my big chance to like write a big feature. It was also a story that was really close to me personally. In my family, almost all of the women, my mom, aunts, relatives, either work as educators or they work in child welfare. And so I grew up hearing about the crisis, how poorly underfunded Indigenous CFS agencies are, how they're often overstretched by the number of kids in care. I heard, and so it was something that like I felt like I had, it was something like I just felt qualified to do this job. And so one day I was on Twitter, and while I was in the early process of reporting the story, I heard about some women giving birth in secret after seeing a tweet about it, and from then on, every time I spoke to somebody, I would ask them, I would ask them about it. I'd be like, hey, have you heard anything about this idea where, some Indigenous women are giving birth in secret? And so, I ultimately did the bulk of this reporting in Winnipeg. I had one particular interview in the North End, which is a neighborhood in Winnipeg that it has a large Indigenous population, and it's known for other social and economic issues. There's a lot of poverty there, and this grandmother who was fighting for her two grandsons invited me into her apartment, and we had coffee and we spoke for a couple of hours about her experience in the foster care system, and as well as her grandsons. She showed me some of the scars on her arms from abuse she suffered while in care. And at the end of our talk, I asked her, have you heard anything about women giving birth in secret to avoid dealing with CFS? She said she had, and that she would ask around for me, see if anybody would be willing to talk to me. And like literally about an hour later, she texted me and connected me with a woman who I refer to as Jen in my story. Jen and I met probably the next day. She was 8 months pregnant and planning to have her baby away from hospital and the secrecy of her own home. At the time, Manitoba's birth alerts policy led to babies being apprehended from their mothers right there at the hospital. And at the time of writing this story, Indigenous children made up nearly 90% of kids in foster care in the province. That birth alerts policy was ended by the province in 2020. So Jen feared this policy. She'd had birth alert scares before in the past, where like she gave birth to her baby daughter and the nurse would kind of go into a corner of the room and talk it over with the doctor, and they'd contact CFS and see if like we should be taking this baby away from this woman. And so, and she had dealt with CFS for many years over her other children. And I knew right away that Jen's story would be important to the story that I was writing. And over the course of my reporting, I spoke to a bunch of mothers, grandmothers, people who work in CFS, family advocates, and groups in and around Winnipeg who were fighting for change. I spoke to another mother, Tamara Malcolm, who lived in Ontario at the time, who had been fighting for her children for over a decade, and had taken to social media to kind of show and prove how safe and clean her home is. Because CFS, as she put it, would sort of make her jump through numerous hoops just to try and get her children back. And so, and like all stories that deal with trauma, getting people to speak to me was a major challenge. I had a very hard time with it. Essentially, at the end of every interview I did, I'd ask the person I'd been interviewing, do you know anyone else who'd be willing to speak with me? And that sort of led me down this sort of rabbit hole where I was talking to all sorts of people who were just so fed up with the child welfare system. Like they had been sort of scared by these agencies into not talking to the press because like it would hurt their case when it came time to like get their kids back. And this is more or less how this one particular story came together. You know, as I note on this slide, the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal ruled against the federal government back several years ago. And since that ruling, issued multiple non-compliance orders to the federal government for not following the orders of the tribunal. And as you might all know, earlier this month, the federal government reached a $40 billion child welfare agreement with First Nations leaders to help compensate for the experience of Indigenous children in care. And I'll talk just real briefly about another story that Yara actually mentioned that I reported on in 2019. It was a story called Not a Drop to Drink, and it was about the water crisis on the Nishnawbe First Nation in Northern Ontario. One of Justin Trudeau's biggest campaign promises to Indigenous peoples leading up to the 2015 election, which of course he won, was to end boil water advisories within 5 years. It was, of course, an ambitious promise that raised a lot of eyebrows and a lot of skepticism as well. The plan or the mission was very rocky from the start. Some First Nations would have their water problems fixed, but then others would enter the list of communities with advisories, and then those communities that thought their problem was fixed would encounter water problems again down the line. And during this period, the promise from Trudeau was being heavily scrutinized by Indigenous leaders and the press. One day I was really curious about, one day I was just super curious. I wondered which First Nation had the longest standing boil water advisory in the country. And through the federal government's online tracker, you could find that out quite easily. And it was Nishnawbe First Nation in Northern Ontario, which is about 430 kilometers north of Thunder Bay. And they were coming up on 25 years without clean drinking water. I reached out to the chief and council and arranged a visit for a few days. The community at the time, I think I arrived there in the winter, and the community at the time was only reachable by plane, aside from a winter road that was available for only a short stretch of the year. And my photographer and I stayed at the First Nations small hotel that they had there. And, you know, we immediately, like a couple of weirdos, just kind of went door to door to people and started asking them about their experience living in this type of environment where there's no safe drinking water, where you know, apparently the water is so contaminated that it's not really safe to take showers. Like some people have cited, you know, getting rashes and skin infections when using the water. And we came across this young family. We came across a young family. The mom's name was Casey Munoz. The father was Ashley Sackany. And they had this 2-year-old son, Meeson. And they were very generous. They invited us into their home, and we spoke a long time about their experience living under a boil water advisory for so many years. Casey Munoz at the time was only 26, and she had never in her lifetime been able to turn on the tap and drink from it. And she tried, so, you know, we spoke for a while in her house, and she eventually kicked us out because it was like coming up on bath time for her 2-year-old son, Meeson. And but basically how they would operate with how they would sort of get by on a daily basis without clean drinking water is they would fill up these water jugs from the local hotel's reverse osmosis machine, which was often unreliable because it would break down, and then the First Nation would have to have bottled water shipped to their community in its place. When she told us about how she bathed her children, which was, you know, they'd go and fetch the water, they heat it up in a kettle, and then they put it in like a sort of inflatable duck. Me and my photographer, we were like, well, can we watch? And we probably sounded like complete weirdos at the time, but we ended up spending the whole evening with the family, talking about life without safe drinking water, and of course observing Meeson's bath time. And it was a very generous opportunity for us to, and it just granted us really great access and a really interesting way to sort of tell the human side of this issue. Casey had never had the luxury of turning on tap water and drinking from it. And this story was published in January 2019, and just a couple months later, in March, the federal government was saying that it would have the community's water treatment plant completed. And Neshanega, to my knowledge, is still under a boil water advisory. And as far as I'm aware, the work on that water treatment system is not completed, and it's been over 26 years. And one quick story I just want to briefly mention, just because I think it kind of highlights my experience as an Indigenous reporter covering certain Indigenous issues, is the aftermath of the Gerald Stanley trial in 2018. This was also for Maclean's, as was the water story I just mentioned. But I'll just mention it briefly because the aftermath of the Gerald Stanley trial in 2018, I think, was a very significant moment for Canada over the past decade or so. Gerald Stanley, a farmer, for those of you who don't know, he was a farmer from rural Saskatchewan who lived near the Red Pheasant Cree Nation and was acquitted in the killing of 22-year-old Colton Boushie. Boushie and a couple of friends had been drinking the day he died, and they had entered on Stanley's property before Stanley shot and killed Boushie. Boushie, at the time of his death, was asleep in the car that him and his friends had been driving in. Stanley's defense rested on the claim that the killing was the result of a hang fire, which is like a delay between the time the trigger is pulled on a gun and when the bullet leaves the barrel. And Stanley had also claimed that he had only intended to fire warning shots at the young people that had come onto his yard. The buildup to the trial and the result of it, as you can probably imagine, created this immense tension between First Nations and white rural residents in and around, well, pretty much all of rural Saskatchewan, but especially around Battleford, Saskatchewan, where the trial took place. I remember my editor, right after he came over to my desk in Toronto to tell me that I had to be in Saskatchewan as soon as possible, he looked at me with this like genuine concern. Like he looked, kind of concerned for my well-being almost. He told me to be careful out there. Be careful of those white guys and their guns, because a lot of like farmers had been, defending, it's not legal, and stand your ground laws are not legal in Canada. But in rural Saskatchewan at the time of this trial, people were, pushing for their right to defend themselves with weapons. And when I was in Saskatchewan, I remember some of the white locals I spoke to saying some pretty shocking things to me. And at least I thought they were really shocking, just given the fact that I think I look pretty Indigenous. I had a guy tell me straight to my face once while I was there that he felt First Nations caused all sorts of problems for people in Saskatchewan. I remember walking into a small museum in a town called Bigger, Saskatchewan, that had a gallery devoted to the history of the KKK in the area. And, not to shit on the museum owner or runner or whatever, but I think it was more out of condemnation than anything. But it was still like incredibly shocking to see and learn about. And they had this like part of the gallery where like literally, this is where it gets a little dark, but like they had like, there was a part of the gallery where like local school children, like not local school children from the past, but actual like kids from that town would like draw pictures of like the KKK. Like they were drawing like pictures of churches being burnt down and houses being burnt down as sort of like a learning experience in their school to learn about the KKK in there. It was very bizarre. That's all I'll say about that. It was very crazy and weird, but yeah, it was just a really strange moment where I actually did feel quite insecure, maybe not unsafe, but uncomfortable in an area that was so that had so much tension at the time. You know, like they weren't happy with reporters coming, especially an Indigenous reporter, coming around and asking questions and you know, just talking about issues that they would rather have kept, you know, ignored. And, you know, as you might have already noticed with some of the stories that I've been telling, they're all very serious stories, stories that attempt to show how the lives of Indigenous peoples intersect with an underlying policy issue, be it foster care, boil water advisories, or the human impact of resource extraction. You know, but I also covered a lot of success stories, you know, during my time at Maclean's. While I was a reporter there, I was able to cover the story of a man who never left his Lake St. Martin First Nation home, even after it was evacuated and flooded and left basically uninhabitable. You know, residents were able to actually never return to this place, like where the site of where their reserve once was. And I was able to cover the story of this like just relentless person who basically dedicated his whole life to living off the land and staying and remain and basically staying put. And you know, I was able to cover Shoal Lake 40 First Nation in Ontario and the completion of Freedom Road, which Freedom Road basically connected them to the rest of Ontario after being basically stranded on a man-made island for so many decades. I was able to cover drone deliveries on the Moose Cree First Nation, Ontario, which had suffered. The Moose Cree First Nation, Ontario is a northern community where, you know, the cost of living and buying groceries and food and basic goods is incredibly high. And they were experimenting with ways to deliver their food by drone, which was a real big success and turning point for them. You know, it can be tough as a journalist sometimes, especially a young journalist. Bad, sad stories are what usually make headlines in the media. I remember when I was a part-time reporter at the Toronto Star on one of those slow news days. And on one of those slow news days, while I was at the Toronto Star, one editor was saying something like, I hope somebody gets stabbed today, just so we could have something to report on. And, you know, those were the types of things that I would hear as a young reporter. And, you know, I remember all the other young part-time journalists at the time being like genuinely shocked by it and being like, this is crazy, essentially. But I'll just move ahead to this next slide here.
Between 1989,
forgot that I had some pictures. Here's Ashley Sackney from the Nishanega First Nation, hauling some of the water in his community. He's going to the reverse osmosis machine and filling up those bottles, and then he'll haul them back on a little sled. I covered this story about you know, man camps in northern British Columbia, and this is a picture of one of those camps where I won't get into this too much, but essentially the gist of it is that in many areas where there is resource extraction and worker camps, there has tended to be an increase in cases of sexual assault, particularly of Indigenous women in those areas. And I'll leave this one up for now, but I want to just quickly touch on my experience being the managing editor at Native News Online. It was my first time working at a company with other Indigenous reporters. Native News Online was sort of like a startup environment. It had been around for a long time, but it was really, while I was there last year, it was really making progress in terms of trying to build out its newsroom and become a bigger operation. And this was like freeing in many ways for me. You know, like I said, I had never been around other Indigenous reporters in my journalism career up until that point. Just on a daily basis level, you know, there was a lot less explaining to do as for why a story was important. It was an opportunity to tell our stories our way. Our goal was to produce quality journalism that uplifts as much as it informs, and to ultimately change the narrative about Indian country and to cover the stories that matter most to Indigenous people. And when I say Indian country, that's because Native News Online was is a US-based publication, but we did, you know, cover a lot of stories in Canada. You know, and just to give you an example, like if we were to cover the tribal economy, which is massive in the United States, it's a $130 billion economy. We didn't just want to focus on casinos. You know, there are more stories. You know, casinos is a sort of the story of the American Indian casino has sort of been this cliche for many years. It's sort of like a stereotype, but there are many ways in which tribal communities are sort of diversifying their economies. Last year, we were able to poll the interest of our readers, and the leading topics of interest were sovereignty and environmental and water rights and preservation. And in collaboration with the Medill School of Journalism at Northwestern, we also launched a survey of American Indians, Alaska Natives, and First Nations people focused on understanding how Indigenous peoples are getting their news and healthcare during the pandemic. We were a small but mighty team, I would say. I managed a single staff reporter and a team of regular contract freelancers. We had the generous help of the Facebook Journalism Project from all around the country. These reporters were from New York City, San Diego, Chicago, Minnesota, the Cherokee Nation, Northern California, and we were also able to welcome interns from places like Northwestern and Drake University during my time there. And so that's a little bit about my experience. And I just want to jump real quick now to maybe the title of this talk, which is Challenging What's Newsworthy. You know, Indigenous communities are often covered very negatively by the media in Canada. And life in Indigenous communities can be often misrepresented by the reporters that get in, report briefly, and then get out, only choosing to swoop in when something tragic or horrible happens. And, you know, I've included some headlines here on this first slide just to sort of demonstrate a bit of what I'm talking about. And there's one here that was really, this one here at the bottom. Well, I want to talk just real briefly about these two headlines here. This one's from the Globe and Mail. Family upset as jury selected for Colton Boushie trial. One thing I'll say about this real quickly is that Colton Boushie was not on trial. Gerald Stanley was on trial. Colton Boushie was shot and killed by Gerald Stanley. And for the Globe and Mail to run a headline like this is completely insensitive, not just to the family of Boushie, but also to Native people across Canada, plain and simple. And this bottom one is from a Canadian reporter who is the, I believe she is the bureau chief of Canada. Drawn from poverty, art was supposed to save Kenya was Inuit. It hasn't. This one actually stirred a lot of backlash throughout the country. The main interviewee in this story was an artist, an Inuit artist, who spoke out a lot about how she was portrayed in the article. It was a lot to do with her struggles as like a sexual assault victim, survivor rather, and less to do about her art. And, you know, this headline, it brought a lot of concern from, the Native American Journalists Association, and the New York Times actually investigated the article itself, but it really encapsulated what a lot of people would consider as like poverty porn in Canadian media, and about life in the North as an Indigenous person. And so, like I mentioned, reporters, the practice often has been that reporters get in and get out. They report on whatever tragedy or issue that is plaguing the Indigenous community that they're in, and then they leave when the story is done. This, by and large, is how our stories are told through the media, which can affect the way Indigenous communities are perceived by the rest of Canada. In 2013, I moved to Toronto to attend X University, formerly referred to as Ryerson. And when I told some of the other journalism students that I grew up on the Lake Manitoba First Nation, a small community north of Winnipeg, they would say things to me like, that must have been rough, or I've heard that there are many problems on reserves, or what was that like? And it was disappointing to hear things like that at the time. Life was not perfect where I grew up, where I come from, but I enjoy going home, and I think a lot of Indigenous people throughout Canada feel the same way. We cherish our homelands and where we come from. In a JHR report that surveyed media outlets between 2018 to 2020, and I think I have a slide of that here. Here's another one. I'll just, before I go on to that, I'll mention this Maclean's cover story, which is my cover story. And I'll mention that I don't like the headline. And particularly because this quote is from one of the few white people in the story. And that disappointed me. And I'll also mention that in the discussion about this cover, my editors had consulted me because they had initially contemplated using, instead of the green font, they initially were thinking about using red. And red beside a graveyard might be deemed as insensitive. So I told them, yeah, that's probably wrong, and you should probably change it. But just moving on real quick. In a JHR report that surveyed media outlets between 2018 and 2020, less than an estimated 2% of stories printed in the media outlets that were studied had Indigenous peoples or issues as their subjects, and less than an estimated 0.1% of stories had Indigenous youth as their subjects. And so Dan David in this, and so just real quick, in 2020, for example, in February, here are some of the spikes, I guess, in media coverage regarding Indigenous peoples. In February of 2020, the Wet'suwet'en anti-pipeline land defense contributed to a bit more mainstream coverage of Indigenous people. In June, it was the deaths of Chantel Moore and Rodney Levi. And in December, it was COVID-19 and other stories. And I will just leave this quote here from journalist Dan David, who wrote a brilliant article in the report from JHR called Room to Rise. He said, these stories are not so much about Indigenous peoples as they are a reflection of Canadian attitudes, lives, and feelings of safety and security. Indigenous peoples are more like props in these stories, bit players to the actors who really matter. It's more about their freedoms, their identities, their rights, and less about Indigenous aspirations. And, I'll mention real quick that an older report from JHR from several years ago, closer to 2010, noted that the salaries of First Nations chiefs was one of these so-called coverage spikes, which is shocking to think about now. It's no secret that Indigenous people in the United States receive very little national news coverage and are often simply erased from nationwide conversations about race. In Canada, it's similar. Indigenous people tend to get a bit more national exposure. But there are similarities in terms of the way Indigenous people are covered and the practices that journalists and newsrooms use to report on these stories. Because even when we do make headlines, the reporting often relies on age-old stereotypes. The story becomes about our suffering, about all the problems that exist in our communities, or about how we stand in the way of pipelines and a prosperous future driven by resource extraction. The journalism about COVID-19 and Indigenous communities in Canada, as well as throughout in Indian country in the US, brought up many of these same discussions as well. At the height of the pandemic in 2020, the Navajo Nation, the largest reservation in the United States, had the highest infection rate per capita in the whole country. It was worse than that of New York, than New Jersey, and anywhere else the virus had left its mark. In February 2021, First Nations people accounted for nearly 70% of Manitoba's COVID cases, despite representing just 10% of the population. Make no mistake, the coronavirus has impacted Indigenous communities far and wide. But for much of that period in 2020, the crisis in the Navajo Nation was a hugely reported story in the American press. It was almost impossible to ignore, really. It meant that there was a barrage of media coverage focused on the tribe and the pandemic, sweeping all corners of Indian country, including from major news outlets like the New York Times and the Washington Post. Here in Canada, I think Canadians were reminded really about how First Nations lack things like access to safe drinking water, or about how many of our communities often suffer from substandard housing and overcrowding, which made things like social distancing practically impossible. Canadians were also reminded of the numerous health disparities that have existed in Indigenous communities for generations, and about how all of these things were really exacerbated by the crisis that was rolling through our communities. And many readers, I often think about this a lot. I think many readers, if you were following the news coverage over the past 2 years about the pandemic's toll on Indigenous peoples, were perhaps learning about these things for the first time. The story was how we Indigenous people were surviving the pandemic, how we were overcoming yet another catastrophe poised to wipe us out. And, I will say that these are important stories, just to be sure. But now the question for journalists, and this comes back to the topic of the name of this talk, of this lecture, the question now for journalists becomes, and newsrooms as well, becomes what's next for Indigenous communities in a post-COVID world, when that day comes, soon I hope. I know the timing here is bad. And how do we tell that story? First Nations, like the rest of Canada, are aching to move past the pandemic. That's not to say we shouldn't forget about what's been lost in our communities. Like so many other places in Canada, we've lost family, friends, relatives, aunties, cousins, elders, tribal leaders, knowledge keepers, historians to this virus. But for so many national news outlets, post-COVID will mean the job is done. Their reporters will move on until the next existential crisis hits our lands. And, as life seemingly returns to normal, the mainstream media's regular programming will too. And I use this line in an article that I wrote for Neiman Reports last year, in reference to this sort of practice that we see over and over again. It's that, it's that the mainstream press, they are there when the ship in Indian country capsizes and sinks, but are absent when it's finally dragged out of the water, rebuilt, and made even stronger. This is where we as journalists need to do things differently. Last year in 2021, when I was managing editor of Native News Online, we covered a milestone moment for the Navajo Nation. In late March, the Navajo Nation reported no new daily COVID cases for the first time in 6 months. And that morning, my editor, Levi, and I celebrated the news. We had reported the daily COVID numbers out of the reservation since the pandemic began, highlighting all of its ebbs and flows and changes. We called it our Navajo update, and it became a real fixture of our reporting. It was one of the brighter days of the pandemic for me. A welcome feeling of relief and joy for the Navajo people. And throughout the pandemic, in addition to reporting on the crisis in Indian country, we focused a lot of our attention on the victories as well, the quote unquote good news. We covered the growing number of tribes that had been working tirelessly to set up their own broadband networks, which would make telehealth and distance learning more accessible. Because, like here in Canada, access to, internet access can be hard to come by in those areas. We covered efforts to reclaim food sovereignty and increase access to healthy traditional foods during the pandemic, and the various ways tribal governments were spending the billions of dollars that they were receiving from the federal government to aid them during the crisis. We covered socially distanced powwows, like you'll see here. Well, this is a sort of similar story with the mask and the native designer, but we covered socially distanced powwows and virtual art festivals, which are an important source of income for so many Indigenous communities, both in Canada and in the US, and which are really an economy onto itself. And we examined the impact COVID-19 has had on elders and languages and on important industries like casinos and tourism. When Levi and I, my editor, when we celebrated the Navajo Nation's 0 case milestone, we actually considered discontinuing our Navajo update. The Navajo government had still been releasing its COVID numbers on a daily basis, but it was really like all good things. There was nothing bad to say anymore. And our traditional journalism brains, you could say, had us thinking, who wants to read this good news? It was a very short conversation because we quickly decided against the idea. But Indian country, as well as Indigenous communities here in Canada, we've lost a lot over the past 2 years. But I really believe that equally important are the efforts being made to ensure that what was lost to COVID is being reborn and rebuilt. So, I encourage all of you young reporters to, be there with your recorders, be there with your notepads when we're thriving, because this stuff is just as newsworthy. All that to say, there needs to be a reframing of what's viewed as newsworthy in Canada. For so long, our tragedies and our responses to those tragedies are what made the headlines. It was the thing you imagined when you thought about Indigenous peoples. And I'll just say this to sort of make this point clearer. It's not about ignoring these horrible, trauma-filled stories, but about diversifying our news coverage to tell a more complete picture about Indigenous life in Canada. When I worked for various news outlets in Canada, Maclean's, The Star, and freelanced a bit as well, I tended to pitch a lot of uplifting stories about Indigenous communities around the country because I truly believed in their power. I thought to myself, I see these types of stories centered around non-Indigenous people, and so perhaps this could also work, framed from an Indigenous perspective. Most of these ideas were flat out rejected. And for a while, I silently protested with a string of incredibly lame animal stories. But unfortunately, that plan backfired tremendously because newsrooms love a good animal story. And I'm sure some of your professors and instructors can back me up on this. And I'll just talk a bit about these slides real quick. This was some of the coverage we did at Native News Online, where we covered this sort of movement of beating face masks, and for various artists around the country that were sort of turning this into, they made this really big. They were going for a lot of money at various art festivals around the country, and just sort of finding ways to be creative throughout the pandemic, where their work wasn't as readily available to consumers throughout that time. You know, we covered Native fitness instructors finding ways to stay active during the pandemic. We covered a tribe in Minnesota that was setting up a pen pal program for elders who were struggling throughout isolation. And the final part of all of this is really, it's my calls to action for you all. And the first one is, don't ignore the good news. It's not hard to find good news or uplifting stories involving Indigenous peoples. And I should preface this by saying some of these are less calls to actions, more like, I don't know, more like advice. I don't know. But so it's not hard to find good news or uplifting stories involving Indigenous peoples, but they're out there. Whether it's about language or cultural revitalization in an Indigenous community, or a First Nations effort to diversify its economy in some way, these stories matter and are going to matter a lot in a post-COVID world. And the second thing here is invest in long-form narrative-driven journalism. And this is, you know, a biased thing of me to say because, you know, I come from a magazine background, and unfortunately, so many reporters and newsrooms do not have the time or resources to pursue projects that dive deep into a particular topic or issue. But feature writing gives readers an opportunity to experience life in another person's shoes. And as someone who's writing a piece of fiction, a book of fiction right now, it's often said that in fiction writing, such as the novel, it fosters empathy and compassion in readers. And I believe the same can be said about long form journalism as well. And I truly believe in the power of long form journalism. And perhaps, you know, I'm biased in saying that, but in many ways, long form journalism or feature writing can be more informative and impactful than traditional news reporting. It gives readers that opportunity to go deeper into a story, offers them a chance to empathize with the people whose lives are being presented in richer detail. And it's also, long form is also a lot less perishable than a regular news article. And in that many great pieces of feature writing often stay relevant and important years after publishing. And when I think of some truly memorable and impactful pieces of journalism, which really shifted my own perception of certain issues and opened my eyes to something important after I'd read them, it's often been a piece of feature writing. The next thing here is stay local and build relationships. And by this I mean, you know, there are 630 First Nations across Canada. And again, this is like more of advice, but there are, you know, find out which communities are near you, which communities are nearest to you, because there's a lot in pretty much every province. What issues do they care about most? what's happening in those communities. They want their stories told, but they just want them done right. And if you are reporting on, so-called Indigenous issues here on number 4, emphasize accountability. And by this, I mean, hold those responsible to account. And, this is something I've got, I guess, from my experience at ProPublica, where accountability journalism is the key thing that we did there. And again, another sort of piece of advice that when I reach out to an Indigenous community or a tribe and ask them what's been going on, one thing I always bring up is there anything the press hasn't been covering? It's something I ask everybody, not just Indigenous people, but is there anything the press hasn't been covering that you think is important and needs to get out there? Because oftentimes we as journalists sort of think we know what's important to the people or the communities that we're reporting in. But sometimes when you ask them what they think is important, it sort of opens your eyes a little bit to the stories that you should actually be covering. Number 6 here is sourcing matters. If you're writing about Indigenous people, make sure you include Indigenous people in your stories. I feel like this, is just a bit obvious, but it's still something I see on a regular basis where, like the journalist Dan David said in his in the JHR report, it's that, oftentimes stories about Indigenous people, stories that are about Indigenous people or an Indigenous community, the Indigenous people in the actual story are sort of like side characters. They're sort of just speaking out against they're sort of put up against this system that's been in place to sort of shut them out. And number 7, and this is the final one, Indigenous stories happen 365 days a year. And by this I mean, Indigenous stories happen all year round, and not just during, an important date on the calendar like Indigenous History Month. News outlets often forget that minorities exist except when they're being highlighted by some event or holiday. And I encourage you to keep that in mind when you are reporting in Indigenous communities, if you are interested in that, just to be sure that you can diversify your news coverage to go beyond just this one spot on the editorial calendar. And really, that really just concludes my lecture. I want to thank you all so much for listening. And I want to give a big thank you to Western University for having me. It's truly been an honor to deliver this year's Clissold Lecture. Miigwech.
Thank you very much, Kyle. And if I can just get you to stop sharing your screen, we'll move on to some Q&A. Thanks, Kyle. That was terrific. Fortunately, we don't get the applause because it's just you and me here chatting on the webinar, but I know from looking at almost nobody's left for this entire talk. So that was a terrific sign. Thank you for sharing your stories with us. Thank you for sharing the stories of the people who trusted you to share and tell their stories. And thanks also for issuing that challenge to the young journalists out there and not so young journalists out there as well to cover Indigenous issues more fully, more completely, and not just to focus on the trauma-based stories. We ran a little bit long, but I want to take some questions because we have Kyle here, and it's a great opportunity for you to ask him a few questions. So we'll take about 10 minutes for some Q&A, and you can just put your questions into the Q&A on your Zoom screen there at the bottom, and we've got a few already. So Kyle, this one kind of comes off of one of your challenges and one of your points, and it's from a recent grad from our program, graduated last year from Alessia. Nice to see you here, Alessia. How can you push, she's asking, how can you push editors to invest in long-form journalism about and for Indigenous people when the daily news cycle with COVID overwhelms everything else and it isn't their main priority?
Right. Well, I mean, it's a huge challenge, especially if you're at a daily news outlet that emphasizes that type of reporting. But, you know, I mean, I may not be the right person to answer this because I've never worked. My experience in a daily newsroom is quite limited. But, you know, I would say that the pitch means everything. And, you know, there are opportunities, and I believe in every newsroom, to pitch stories. I mean, even daily news outlets pursue long-term projects. And so, you know, I would talk to your editors and build a great relationship with the people that you work with, and let them know that you're interested in pitching stories that aren't just going to take a few days to turn around, but a longer period of time, and stress the importance and value of them. I think it just really comes from that type of communication. And you'll see that, you know, news outlets like CBC Indigenous, for example, which I really admire, the bulk of their work is, you know, daily reporting, but they do take the time to invest in longer term projects, which have, I mean, they did a series on the 94 call to actions from the TRC recently, or a couple of years ago. And it was this, you know, expansive piece of work. And I think if you just approach it from that respect, I think, you know, you might find some success there.
Thanks, Kyle. And there's a lot of thank yous popping up into the Q&A section as well for your talk. No, they can't reach you any other way. I should have mentioned Alessia was working at the Hamilton Spectator recently. I think she's now moved over to the Toronto Star. So one of your places you've written for. Next question is from Percy. I think he graduated in 2017, also from our program, now doing his PhD here at FIMS. He asks, in addition to newsworthiness, how can academia and specifically journalism programs intervene to provide ways to rethink and perhaps replace other journalistic ideals like objectivity, distance, fairness, and balance?
Okay. Is there a way to read that again? Sorry.
Yeah, I think you can, try to tap on the Q&A at the bottom of your screen.
Okay.
And then if you scroll down to Percy, he's about 5 down. Percy, yeah. He's in orange.
Yes. Perfect. Well, I mean, I think there is work being done on this already. I really do. I know that Western is bringing in, you know, someone like, gosh, I can't remember her name. Jeremy, can you help me out? Angela Stewart.
Angela Stewart, yes, from CBC in Vancouver.
Yeah, and there are, I believe, a couple different Indigenous faculty members now at X University in Toronto, where I did my journalism degree. And I think that's really where it starts. If you want to emphasize reporting in Indigenous communities and the proper way to go about it, reach out to Indigenous people to maybe join your faculty, to join your school. And when I was doing my journalism degree, the 4 years that I was at X University, there were no Indigenous faculty. The only reporting on Indigenous people's course was an online course taught by someone who wasn't Indigenous, and from my knowledge did not have much experience reporting on Indigenous communities. And when we would talk about issues of race or people of color in journalism, Indigenous people received a very, very small segment of attention. I remember in a class called Critical Issues in Journalism, I remember we discussed Indigenous people for maybe all of 5-10 minutes. and then we just kind of moved on to other things. So I think that's where it begins. And I'm so, every time I see an Indigenous journalist join a faculty of journalism somewhere around the country, I think it's just a really great thing.
Thank you, Kyle. And I will just acknowledge, because I know they're here tonight, we've been fortunate to have two new faculty members join our faculty, the Faculty of Information and Media Studies, Sally Kiwayosh and Sophia Locklear. So we've added two Indigenous scholars to our faculty, which we were very excited about. Next question comes from Amanda, who is not a graduate of our program, but she did teach here a while back, and she's currently the executive producer of the CBC here in London. She says thank you, and it's down at the bottom if you want to follow along, Kyle. It's in blue. Post-pandemic, what advice do you have for reporters who are visiting a First Nation, and how can reporters show respect?
Well, yeah, this is a question that I've always had myself. And basically, I would just suggest to follow the community's protocols. I think different communities have various protocols in place. And it's a tough one because every community is going to vary, but I think in the post-pandemic period, it's going to be challenging to, even for right now, it's challenging to do some of this reporting on the ground because you want to remain sensitive to the community and some of the challenges that they're facing. But my advice would just be to have a really close dialogue with the leadership of that community and see which way and see what they're comfortable with, what you're comfortable with, and to just respect that, verbal contract that you make with your sources and with the community that you're planning on visiting.
Thanks, Kyle. You talked in your story, Not a Drop Drink, about how you're welcomed into people's homes and they're sharing their lives with you and welcome you into their homes to share their lives with you and have you trust you to share their stories with a greater audience. What sense of responsibility comes with that as a journalist?
Is this who's answering? Whose question is this?
Yeah, you have to look at my notes to get that one. Sorry, Kyle.
Sorry.
That's mine.
Can you repeat the question? Sorry.
Yeah, of course. Just when you're being welcomed into people's homes, the way you were, and they're opening up and trusting you to tell their stories with very personal stories. How does that feel, and what sense of responsibility as a journalist comes with that?
Yeah, I think with some of the examples I brought up, where I'm meeting with somebody who's been put in a very vulnerable place, I obviously try to be incredibly respectful. I want them to know that I'm on their side. Like in the examples that I brought up, I try to be, as sensitive as I can to them in my reporting. And, unfortunately, I've had instances where, editors have told me that my work sounds very advocacy, like it sounds like a piece of advocacy. And my response was always, well, I'm just trying to be mindful of the experience that I've gone through, and I want to just sort of accurately portray what their life is like. And I'm the type of person where if somebody wants to see a draft of my story, and I'm sure people get that all the time, can I look at your draft? I get that all the time from people. And I usually say no, because I don't want, people other than my editors editing the story. But, I just try to remind the people that I'm interviewing that that I want to tell this story the right way, that I want to hopefully portray you in a way that's going to affect the way people see this particular issue.
Thanks. I'll take one last question. It's the one from Dan in blue at the bottom there. And it's a long one, so you might want to scroll down to get to it. And I'll just read it out for the audience. We used to think that our news stories were only being read when we got published by the News from Indian Country Today, The Circle, and Navajo Times in the USA. Canadian newsrooms were not interested. And then APTN appeared, and Radio Networking has recognized NAJA as operational for over 30 years now. We still do not have a network of Indigenous journalists up here. How would you organize one? We have tried guest speaking at the CHA. The journalists want a national network since there's so many of us now. Most of us belong to NAJA and have pitched a Canadian NAJA down there to no response. There's no movement. What do we have to do?
Right. Yes, Canadian Indigenous journalists are able to join NAJA in the US. In fact, the president of NAJA right now is a reporter, an Indigenous reporter at CBC. So if you wanted like a sort of, I'm not sure. I've actually never been a part of NAJA myself. I mean, I've been a member of NAJA, but I've never been on the board or anything in the leadership or anything like that. But you know, I mean, I have a lot of respect for NAJA. I'll say that up front. I have a lot of respect for them, and I think they represent the interests of Indigenous journalists in Canada very, very well. It would be great to, you know, have a Canadian equivalent, I suppose. But you know, as for why the CAJ has no interest in bringing that up, I'm not sure. I mean, I don't know. For me personally, I really appreciate this sort of collaboration between Indigenous journalists on both sides of the border. And, you know, if there was, you know, a similar thing here in Canada, great. But, you know, I would also just like to see more Indigenous journalists be involved at NAJA as well.
Thank you. Thanks to Dan Smoke for submitting that last question. And thank you. We're gonna wrap it up there. Thank you everybody for joining us tonight. And thank you so much again, Kyle, for taking the time to answer so many questions. Just gonna remind the current MMJC students who are here in about 5 minutes, we'll start a mixer on another Zoom call with Kyle. He's been very generous to share his time with the class. And thank you everybody again for joining us here tonight. And Kyle, on behalf of everybody in the audience, thank you so much.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.